a board of trustee at Hammond-Harwood House. It's a privilege to be in that role. And I am also a food historian. So I will be your presenter today as well as your moderator. Before I move on to the program itself, I would just like to acknowledge that this program is part of the Catherine H. Farr Lecture Series. And Catherine Farr is a longtime supporter of Hammond-Harwood House and has served as a docent for many years, giving tours of the house she loves so well. And her love for the collections, as well as the architecture, is manifested in her philanthropic efforts to support special programs such as this one, making it free today for anyone who would like to see it. So we're really privileged to be able to have that opportunity to offer you through Catherine Farr. We really appreciate her generosity and look forward to more programs with her in the future. So now just to give you a little bit of background about myself, as I said, I'm on the Board of Trustees. I'm a food historian. My background is actually in museum education, and I've been doing sort of a combination of museum education and food education, food history education for many years, decades, going back to the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. My other role in a museum in Maryland is as the food historian at Riversdale House Museum in Prince George's County. When I started there in 2006 as their museum educator, this love of food history just grew and grew, and it sort of took over and brought me to the point where I am today, where I'm giving freelance talks. I do consulting for a variety of different museums, including the William Pickett House in Annapolis, as well as the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans. And I also write. I love to write articles. I write for Outlook by the Bay, as well as MarylandRoadTrips.com, Chesapeake Family Magazine, and other local magazines. So that's a little bit about me. Now I just want to get into a little bit of the mechanics of this program. We are going to share the screen, so hopefully you'll be able to have a good view of all the slides that I'm going to show you. My programs are always very image rich. And in addition to that, if you could all make sure that your sound is on mute so that we don't hear the dog barking or your phone ringing or anything else going on in the background, that would be great. And if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat. I might not see it while I'm chatting to you, but at the end, I can go through and scroll through the messages and see that, or you can just wait and ask the questions at the end. Sometimes it's good to write your questions down when you're actually thinking of them, because then you forget. So it's nice to have that chat option where you can do that. And you can send that to everyone, or you can just send it to me or Hammond-Harwood House, which is actually our curator, Rachel Lovett. So she's on this as well. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully, of course, it's not working. Hold on. It's always something. Let me just go back here and bring that up. Okay, here we go. Okay, so let's do one more thing here on my screen. Okay, so decadent dining, imported food and drink in early Annapolis. So this presentation today is designed to go together or in conjunction with Hammond-Harwood House's current exhibition. So it's a temporary exhibition that was put up in March of 2020. And every March, Rachel, our curator, does a wonderful exhibition in the temporary gallery space. And of course, in 2020, just as she rolled it out, we had to go into lockdown. So that exhibition has been extended through the end of this year. And in addition to that, Rachel's done a wonderful thing, a way to keep this exhibition going for a much longer time even, by creating a catalog for it. And these are hot off the presses, and they can be purchased at the Hammond-Harwood House gift shop for just $10, and they're really beautiful. I haven't seen the actual printed copy yet, but I've seen the mock-ups for it, and it's really quite impressive and a great way to remember this exhibition, and offers you a great information that not only highlights Annapolis's history, but of course highlights the collection. So that's a great little memento of this exhibition to have. So now we're going to look at the rise of the gentry and the habits of consumption during Annapolis's golden age, which is roughly 1763 to just at the start of the American Revolution, about 1774 or so. It goes on a little bit longer than that. But just to give you a little bit of background, before the golden age, the late 1690s when Annapolis was settled and the early 1760s, in that time period, the chief industries were shipbuilding, no surprise, and tanning. And 1708 was when the first tan yard opened in Annapolis, and it was followed by at least 3 others. And then in 1735, a local businessman, Patrick Cray, is I believe the correct way to pronounce that, he established a shipbuilding industry, and he became the best known shipbuilder in Annapolis. The prosperity of those industries led to a variety of other industries to support the services required by shipbuilding and tanning. So saddle makers, block makers, rope makers, and other things as well, including things just to support the local population, such as taverns, were all growing throughout these early years of Annapolis's history. And a lot of these businessmen actually branched out into other areas because they saw a need. They saw a way to make money to fulfill the needs of the growing population. So people such as Patrick Cray and tavern keeper Samuel Middleton also became importers to bring in products that they believed the growing population of Annapolis wanted, with a growing amount of disposable cash. Of course, that's limited to a small sector of society, but it was there nonetheless. Here's an example of Patrick Cray importing things such as rum, muscovado sugar, and limes, also brandy as well, and other things like wine. We're going to talk more about these particular products. Samuel Middleton, who you may recognize that name today from Middleton's Tavern, which is still there. He also sold things in addition to running his tavern. He sold coffee, chocolate, which of course things that he would have sold in his tavern, as well as loaf sugar, which he would have used, as well as a variety of other things. And again, we'll go over more of those specifics later. Now we're going to look at that golden age of affluence. At this time period, Annapolis was described as being, quote, the genteelest town in North America. The growth of wealth was really based on this political seat of power, which Annapolis became. This is still where the Annapolis legislative session is held every winter from the second week of January to about the second week of April. It's a 90-day session. And because of that session, you not only are the legislators in town, but their staffs, their other support services as well for government. So all of these people here, many of whom were wealthy enough, or at least had a bit of disposable income that they could afford to buy some luxury items. At this time as well, we have the growth of several elegant townhouses, which were not just places for residence for these legislators and other wealthy people, but these places were used as seats of power as well. As you're having a fancy dinner party, it's going to be an opportunity to lobby for your best interests. So all of these things are related. I want to talk a little bit about these houses. So there were many, and in the period between 1764 and 1774, just in that 10-year period, 14 major townhouses and 4 combo residences, businesses were built in Annapolis. So starting with Charles Carroll's house, Carrollton, I should say, from 1764, the Peka House, Samuel Chase, which is right across the street from the Hammond-Harwood house from 1769, 1771, Wallace, Davidson, and Johnson. This was a group of partners who were merchants, and they built their storehouses, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a second. Other people like Thomas Rutland, and then of course our very own Matthias Hammond, who started the construction of Hammond-Harwood House in 1774. So here's the Peka House, for those of you who may not come to Annapolis regularly. and of course, Hammond-Harwood House. I'm not going to show you all the pictures of the houses just in the interest of time today. Now we're going to look at the importers and suppliers during that golden age. So from the 1760s to the 1770s, there were many merchants who sort of worked as importers and ran stores where they sold their goods that they were importing. So some of the more popular ones were John Buchanan and Son, Thomas Williams, James Dick, Lancelot Jacques, McCubbin, Anthony Stewart, we're going to talk a little bit more about him, and the firm of Charles Wallace, John Davidson, and Joshua Johnson, among many others. Again, I had to pick a few just to give you some highlights. Here are just some examples when you're looking through the Maryland Gazette, which was the newspaper of the 18th century in Annapolis. You're going to see advertisements for a variety of goods that are being brought into not just Annapolis, but London town, which of course is just south of Annapolis, as well as Baltimore. And when we get towards this time period of the Golden Age and even later. So the amount of goods is just staggering, as you're going to see. James Dick and Anthony Stewart here. And then John Boyd, who imported into Baltimore for a fair amount of the time. Now I want to focus on Wallace, Davidson, and Johnson. So in 1769, Charles Wallace purchased land essentially from the foot of a Church Street, which is really down by City Dock today, up towards State Circle. And on that property, he created Annapolis's Fleet and Cornhill Streets, which are still there today, and they come together at a point. And at that point where those streets come together, Wallace planned to build 4 rows of stores to house the goods that the company was importing off the wharf at the Severn River. So to make it as convenient as possible. So here's some images of that spot. So those of you who know Annapolis, this will be no surprise, but again, for those of you who don't, you can see it on the map where it's just kind of hitting right at the foot of Eagle Alley there and coming together to create this sort of V in the center of this, this area of Annapolis. So that's where these 4 stores would have been. And there are documents, there are letters that do indicate that these houses were built, these warehouses were built. And though I don't have any other information about them at this time. In 1771, that was when Wallace actually partnered with John Davidson, who was the Port of Annapolis Deputy Naval Officer, so he would be a good person to have working with you as an importer, and Joshua Johnson, who was a merchant. And they together imported goods mainly from London, and they were brought to Annapolis. And it was Johnson who actually went to London and lived there for several years and made these acquisitions of the goods that he thought would do best in the Annapolis market. And the business, as any fledgling business, it's not always easy to make money. They had to deal with a lot of economic and political obstacles, particularly in the 1770s. If you know anything about American history at that time, you know there were several incidents and acts that were passed that really impacted importation of goods into America. So they had to deal with all that. They only stayed in business for about 45 years, but throughout that time period, they shipped almost 48,000 pounds, British sterling pounds worth of goods to Annapolis. So that's a fair amount of goods. And now we're gonna look at some of these goods, not just the ones that Wallace, Davidson, and Johnson shipped, but many of the things that other importers shipped to Annapolis as well. Oops. And here are some ads from Wallace, Davidson, and Johnson, just so you can get a feel. So they were not just shipping, food, but a variety of cloth and other, sundry materials for making clothing, as well as jewelry and sailcloth and a variety of things. So now we're going to look at some of these products. So cheese. In 1672, Governor Charles Calvert wrote in a letter to his father that he, quote, could not find decent cheese anywhere in Maryland, with the exception of one skilled woman. I've done a lot of research into Maryland's dairy history, and that's pretty true. If you wanted milk, butter, cottage cheeses, or other types of soft farmers cheeses, that was fine. But any kind of hard cured cheese did not do really well in Maryland. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which we don't really have time to go into today, but suffice it to say that if you wanted a good cheese, you had to import it. Most of the cheeses were being imported from Europe, some from New England, some from New York, I'm sure, New England in particular. So what were those top 18th century cheese imports into Annapolis? Well, they were Cheshire cheese, Gloucester cheese, there were a couple of varieties of those, and Rhode Island cheese. So Cheshire cheese is probably the most popular, and it was, it still is, you can still buy it. I know my Giant here in Annapolis sells it. It's a cheddar style cheese, which has to do with the way that it's produced. It's cheddaring as a style. It's from Cheddar, England, but it's also a style of folding the curds onto each other. And it's made in the Cheshire region of England. So not just in Cheshire County, but in sort of surrounding counties there. And at that location, the cows graze on grass that's being grown on salt flats, and it gives it a distinctive salty, but also nutty flavor. So it's definitely gives it a different taste than traditional cheddar. So it's definitely different and worth trying if you've ever tried it. And these cheeses were made in extremely large wheels. And by the middle of the 18th century, they were making them in 30 to 60 pound wheels, so very large. The cheeses were made to be transportable. So in other words, they were processing them so that they could be as low in moisture as possible. Because of course, when you have moisture in any kind of food, really, that's when the food can go rancid. So what they did with these cheeses that they were made them in wooden presses, which were pierced with small holes. And the cheese itself would be pierced with skewers through these holes. And that would encourage and allow for the release of more whey. And the whey is that watery part of the cheese. So, you've got your curds and whey. You just want curds. You don't want whey. Of course, it's almost impossible to get all the whey out right away. That's why you have to press your cheese. So as you press your cheese, you're pressing out the whey. And when Cheshire cheeses are made, they're made in a way, again, to ensure most of the moisture gets out by mixing the curds with a dry salt mixture, which really tends to draw out the moisture from the cheese. And salt is also rubbed on the outside of this. So all of this together is going to produce a cheese that will dry out evenly so that the center is just as dry as the outsides. And that, again, will keep it from turning rancid, which will make it very easy to ship. You will not have to worry about it going rancid. So in 1725, around 13.8 million pounds of Cheshire cheese were shipped from London's docks. And a lot of that came to Annapolis. And this is sort of a fun little anecdotal story I found in the newspaper in 1769. Our signer of the Declaration of Independence, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, kept some cheeses and sugar and other things stored away, and he was robbed. This storehouse was robbed, and they took one Cheshire cheese, which again could have been as much as 60 pounds, as well as 5 Gloucester cheeses and 30 pounds of clade sugar. And we're going to talk about clade sugar in just a bit. And of course, he was offering, information, possibly a reward, all those things for the recovery of these items and apprehension of the thief. But as far as I know, this mystery was never solved, and Charles Carroll never received his property back. Gloucester cheeses, so 5 Gloucester cheeses were stolen. Oftentimes you'll see Gloucester cheeses written as either single Gloucester or double Gloucester. So what does that mean? Historically, all Gloucester cheeses were made from Gloucester cattle, which is a particular breed of cattle. And in single Gloucester, they were made between April and November, which is typical of the dairy season. Usually summer was the big cheese making time of year. And this particular cheese was made from semi-skimmed milk. So milk that has some of its cream still in it. And it was considered single height. Compare that to double Gloucester, which was made with a combination of milks. It could be from full fat milk, which would be very rich. It could be from milk taken from two milkings. So it could be from an evening milking mixed with a morning milking, and there could be different qualities to those milks. You could mix milk with cream as well. And what you're doing here is when you're mixing, the morning milk with the evening milk too, that evening milk has, at least 12 hours or so to sit and start to develop flavor and start to take on good bacteria, which of course good cheese is filled with good bacteria as opposed to bad bacteria. And when you're doing this, you're really kind of trying to manipulate the bacteria levels of the cheese. Oftentimes these double Gloucester cheeses were often sold in wheels that would be double the height of the single Gloucester. It's a way of distinguishing between the two. So these are the types of cheeses that would have been coming in from the Gloucester area. So what is Rhode Island cheese? Rhode Island cheese was made in the Narragansett area of Rhode Island. And this cheese was developed in the 1630s by the Smiths, so Richard Smith and his wife. And it was Mrs. Smith who brought a recipe for Cheshire cheese with her to the New World, to Rhode Island, and started to create her version of it in Rhode Island. So anytime you make cheese out of its normal, place of origin, same with wine, same with tea, same with even chocolate, you're going to take on the taste of the land, and it's going to take a different bent. It's going to have a different flavor. It's going to be a little different than how it was meant to be in its original location. So the Rhode Island cheese would be marked as Rhode Island cheese because it's not really Cheshire cheese. It's not coming from Cheshire. It's an American version of this type of cheese. And it's the only cheese identified by its place of origin at that time. So in and of itself, that was significant. This image of this house is of the Smith family home that they built in 1678. I'm sure this has been, altered throughout the years, but this is what's there now in Wickford, Rhode Island. Now to talk a little bit about the unsavory part of Rhode Island cheese is its history with slavery. It's been documented that Rhode Island cheese in Rhode Island was made with enslaved dairymaids. And one of the largest dairies had 24 enslaved dairymaids who made, several dozen cheeses per day. And these were in the 20 to 30 pound range. That's still pretty significant. Much of the cheese, to add further to this history with slavery, was actually exported from Rhode Island to the West Indies to feed enslaved workers there. And then therefore this was part of a triangle trade where molasses and sugarcane was imported to New England, where it was made into rum, and you've got these different trade networks going through. So, so that's a little bit about the history of cheese. Now we're going to look at sugar, and there were a variety of different sugars that were imported into 18th century Annapolis. So we have molasses, and then muscovado, also called Barbados sugar. Sometimes molasses was also really referred to as Barbados sugar. Then we have single refined loaf sugar and double refined loaf sugar. And I'm going to talk about each of these. Here's an advertisement from Stewart and Richardson. And you can see there is muscovado sugar by the barrel and molasses by the hogshead. So this was very common. Even going back to very early in the 18th century, you're going to see sugar and particularly molasses being imported into Annapolis. And here's another one. This is Charles Wallace and Company. He's got muscovado sugar as well as Barbados rum, which is, of course, would have been made from molasses. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. They also were importing refined loaf sugars, and I'll explain what that means in a bit. And these in particular were coming from London, but also from Boston and Philadelphia. So again, it doesn't have to be coming in from too far away. So sugar, of course, has its dubious history in its association with slavery as well. And life on a sugar plantation was probably the harshest existence possible. When Africans were brought over from Africa to the New World early on, particularly in the 17th century, but certainly into the 18th century as well, they were often brought to the islands where they had to undergo a period of seasoning. So they'd go through a season there. They'd go, and however long that was, it could be 3 months, 6 months, however long, in which they worked on these sugar plantations. And this is men, women, and children. And the climate in the islands is harsh. There's a lot of course, New World diseases that African people were just not immune to. And the work itself was extraordinarily dangerous. Limbs could be crushed very easily. You could get burns from working with the sugar vats when you're boiling down the sugar. When you're stirring the vats, you may also fall into the vats, which would be a horrific death, and most likely that would have been horrible. In the earliest days, very little was given to the enslaved for food. They often were given seeds and had to grow their own food, or trap their own proteins, their own animals. A lot of slave traders in those early days brought seeds of these crops with them to the islands. And that explains a huge reliance upon, or a huge influence of African cuisine within the Caribbean diets today. Of course, that changed over time, and rations were applied, just depended on the time period and where you were. But you would probably still be growing a lot of your own food. So you're working this, probably 12 to 15-hour day, and you still have to tend crops, which is, a ridiculous amount of work expected. After this period of seasoning, if a slave on one of these plantations survived, then they often were sold further north to the North American colonies, and often for a huge profit. Particularly men of, young men who were very strong, they would be, sold for hundreds and hundreds of pounds. So this was not, a part of our history that we like to think about, but certainly one that you can't disentangle from the concept of food history, because it's with us no matter what, no matter where we are, whether we lived in an area where there was slavery or not. At that time, chances are you were probably buying products made with slave labor. Consequently, if you were living in a North American colony, and if you were someone who was enslaved and you were acting out, you were rebelling, you might be threatened with being sold down the river. And that, by the 19th century, of course, meant late 18th, early 19th century, down the Mississippi River, down to areas like New Orleans, where there were sugar plantations as well, and where, of course, there was an easy port to ship you down even further south. So it was essentially a death sentence. Enslaved men, women, and children worked on the sugarcane, particularly during harvest, for at least 18 hours a day. That was probably the longest day they would have. And they were using sharp knives, cutting everything by hand, of course. The men were expected to cut at least 3 tons of cane per day and then pack it back to the sugar mills onto donkeys. So they had to tie it onto the donkeys and transfer it to the sugar mill. So again, an extraordinary amount of work. So what goes on in these sugar mills, on the plantations? So once the sugar cane has been harvested, it's immediately crushed in a mill, which was operated. There were different types of mills. So on the top, you have oxen moving around a circular path, sort of like a threshing barn, where the cane was going to be, again, sort of pressed so that the juice could come out. At the bottom of this picture here, there's a hand crank, which would be, extremely dangerous. And oftentimes these were powered by water, as you can see. So just a variety of options, just depended on where you were. So what happens once this juice has been crushed out of the cane? At that point, then it has to be funneled down to the boiling house. And you can see in this image, I've got the arrow there. If you can see, there's sort of a chute that goes from the cane crushing mechanism down to the boiling house, where there's a series of copper boiling pans that are set into a masonry flue, which is heated from below. You can see underneath, there's those arched openings with smoke coming out, and that's where the fuel would be put. And oftentimes it was spent cane stalks, again, to not waste anything and to optimize profits. And here's another version of a boiling house. So in order to process the cane into sugar, several things have to occur. First, a lime and water mixture is added to the cane juice in that first pan on the far left of your screen there. It's labeled with a B. And at this point, it's going to be boiled for about an hour or maybe more, it just depends. And what the lime is going to do is going to attract the impurities in the sugar, that sugar cane juice. And they're going to collect. If you've ever made a meat stock from scratch, you'll notice when you put raw bones into water, bring it up to a boil, there's this bubbly scum that rises to the top. And this is exactly what's happening here. A bubbly scum is going to rise to the top and it's going to get skimmed off the top. So it's the lime is basically rising to the top and it's taking with it impurities that are going to get skimmed off. After each boiling, the sugar in one vat is going to again move to the from left to right, according to this picture. And you're going to go through this process each and every time. And with each and every time, the sugar liquid is going to get thicker because you're boiling off more of the moisture until you finally get to the battery vat, which is the final one on the right, where the sugar syrup now is right, it's at the right viscosity, right consistency for striking or crystallization. And that occurs in a separate area. And there are a couple of images here. We've got the striking vat on the left, and then we've got a room full of striking vats. And what the people are doing, and of course, most of these people would be enslaved, is you're going to let the syrup, you're going to pour the syrup from that battery vat into the striking vat, and you're going to allow it to stay in those trays for about 24 hours. And you have to rake it constantly to prevent it from hardening. And as it cools, sugar crystals are going to form. And the liquid that doesn't form into the crystals is molasses. So after the 24 hours is over, you're going to take that sugar syrup and you're going to place it into these hogsheads, or these large barrels that have been drilled. The bottoms of them have been drilled with holes, and they're going to be plugged with canes. So sort of like a dowel or something, if you think of it that way. And then they're set upon these frames, and they'll be placing vats underneath. And as the sugar cools and sits in the barrel, it's going to contract. And when that happens, the openings around, or the opening around the cane will form. And liquid molasses, the additional liquid molasses that's in this sugar is going to seep out of those holes and going to then be collected underneath. And what you're going to have underneath is, again, molasses. And what's going to be left in the hogsheads is basically pure brown sugar, or what we would call muscovado sugar historically. A difference between muscovado sugar and brown sugar that you buy in the store today is different. So muscovado sugar is going to be brown through and through because it's never been refined to white sugar. Domino brown sugar, everything gets separated out. So you're going to have when you're in one of these, commercial sugar plants today, all the molasses gets taken out of the sugar. So you're going to have pure white sugar and pure molasses. When they make brown sugar, what they're doing is they're putting the white sugar in a mixer, and they're adding in molasses in essentially a tumbler. And they're going to turn the tumbler, and that molasses coats each crystal of sugar. So that if you had a microscope and you could slice open each sugar crystal, you're going to see brown on the outside, but white on the inside. So it's essentially painted sugar. So it's a little different. The next stage is packing. So the molasses and sugar crystals are separated at this point. The unrefined sugar, which is still not white, right? It's just brown sugar. It still needs to be refined further if we want white sugar. But that Muscovado sugar is going to be packed into the barrels, or these barrels are going to be then shipped off all over the world to sugar refineries. And in 1750, there were 120 sugar refineries in England. That's just in England. There were sugar refineries in America, particularly in the Alexandria region, and then in Maryland in the 19th century, there were a lot of sugar refineries in Baltimore region. So how was white sugar made? So when you're looking at advertisements in the 18th century and even in the 19th century and earlier, it's called loaf sugar. And they're going to be, it's going to be made in different degrees of refinement. But how is this made? So there's a process called claying. So when we talk about clayed sugar, we're talking about refined sugar. And it can be treated usually 1 to 3 times. So the longer it's treated, the more times it's treated, the whiter it's going to be. And what they do is they use these conical shaped molds and they soak them in water and then plug the tops off because the tops have holes in them. They plug them up with twists of paper and then they set them in a base or a pottery jar, which can catch any of these impurities, any further molasses, all of the refining clays that are going to go through it. So you place the unrefined sugar in the cone that's turned upside down in the pot. As the sugar hardens, the twists of paper in the very bottom of the tip of the cone are going to be removed. Then a white clay slip. So you're going to take clay and water and mix it together. And you're going to pour that on top of the sugar at the opening at the widest part of the cone. And then you're going to place these in a heated drying chamber for about 5 days. And during that time period, the clay slip is going to soak down through into the sugar, taking with it all of those impurities, and that's going to drip into those jars. And it does this without dissolving the sugar, just to note that. Once the sugar is white enough and it's completely solid, the cone is then turned over, it's tapped, the sugar loaf is then released. And at the top, at the very pointy edge, there's going to be, it's going to look a little wonky. So they're going to have to shape it with a nosing tool. The hard clay that's on the very widest part is going to have to get cut off. And then they're going to wrap it in blue paper. And the reason white sugar was wrapped in blue paper is because blue tends to make white look whiter. So it was just a way to trick your eye into thinking it was as white as possible. And there were different grades of these clayed sugars. So single refined and double refined. So single, meaning that it went through this process once, and double, meaning it went through it twice. Those were the most popular varieties of sugar that you're going to find in 18th century Maryland. Triple refined, also called royal sugar, was the most refined. It was the whitest. And you don't really see that too much here, at least not in Maryland. You do see it in royal count books, things like that in England, but not too often here. Another version of clayed sugar is also referred to as Lisbon sugar, and it's named for sugar that was prepared in Cuba and Brazil and any other Portuguese colony. And it was clayed in a similar way, but it was done in a little bit differently, in a way that each cone would be 3 different colors, essentially. This one in the image here, it's hard to see it, but the very bottom is the white. And then just above it for about an inch or so is a little bit darker. And then of course, the majority of it is darker yet. And what these were was these sugar cones would be sliced up according to their color and sold based on the level of whiteness. So you could buy, a little bit of this Lisbon sugar, and just depending on what you could afford, you could buy different grades, and you wouldn't have to buy as much. Then you could take it home and actually refine it yourself by melting it, heating the sugar, mixing it with not clay, because that's probably not what you're going to use, but you might use pig's blood or eggshells, things like that, to also attract the impurities. They'll rise to the top and skim it off, and then you can package it away for later use. So of course, the resulting product that you would make from the molasses would be rum. That would be the most profitable thing made out of molasses. Of course, they sold molasses. Again, it was a cheaper form of sugar. But rum was certainly quite popular. And this is an image of a pot still from the Mount Gay Rum distillery in Barbados. So now we're going to move on to spices. So a lot of spices were popular in the 18th century. Salt, of course, and a variety of different types of salts, different sea salts would be popular. Black pepper was also extremely popular, as well as ginger. Those I'd say were the three earliest on that you see regularly. As the decades go throughout the 18th century, you start to see more and more things like mustard, cinnamon, nutmeg, mace, cloves, coriander seeds. Coriander gives us what we would know today as cilantro, but you can eat the seeds as well. Caraway seeds, allspice, which is Jamaica pepper, and aniseed. I'm going to talk about some of these in detail. So ginger, again, was probably the most popular and the earliest. So ginger is essentially a rhizome, meaning it's an underground plant stem. It grows just under the surface of the soil. So it's not really a root as much as it is the plant itself growing underground. It's native to parts of Asia and really integral to a lot of the different Asian cuisines that have been around for, probably thousands of years, but of course now very popular as well. Ginger was used widely in ancient Roman and Greek cuisines, and it was very popular in the medieval European cookery, their recipes that we find in England, France, all over. And it was very popular in Maryland as well. So gingerbread probably being one of the most prolific recipes that we see for ginger. And this is a version of gingerbread from the 18th century as well, using 18th century molds to help decorate them. Ceylon cinnamon was the other spice that was really, really popular in the 18th century. Now this is different from today's cinnamon. So this is Cinnamomum zeylanicum or Cinnamomum verum, and it's different. Ceylon cinnamon comes from Sri Lanka, or how it used to be known as Ceylon, which is an island off the coast of southern India. It's a little different in look than the cinnamon we know today. It's very flaky. It's very much thinner than today's cinnamon, and it's very brittle. It's almost like they call them quills of cinnamon. They're really easy to grind in mortar and pestles as well. So it's a little bit more practical when you don't have electric machinery to help you do this. You can buy this kind of cinnamon very easily in Hispanic grocery stores or departments and supermarkets. It's sold as canela entera or Mexican whole cinnamon. That was, of course, introduced to that region, to Mexico and Central America by the Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century. The type of cinnamon that we know is cassia, and it comes from Burma, which is Myanmar now, Indonesia, Vietnam, and China. And it's just a different variety of cinnamon. It's much harder. It's got a slightly different flavor. So it's a little bit different than what we know today. Allspice is also known as Jamaica pepper. It comes from a tree in the myrtle family, Pimenta officinalis. And the spice comes from the dried unripe berries of that tree, which are native to Jamaica. And it's the only spice whose cultivation still is confined to the Americas, particularly Jamaica. It's been tried to be reproduced in other areas, and it's just been unsuccessful. And the English named it allspice because its flavor is sort of this combination of cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and black pepper. Plus it looks like pepper. So we've got allspice, Jamaica pepper, this product that looks like pepper that comes from Jamaica, but tastes like all these different spices combined. Now let's look at some of the Spice Island imports. So spices of the Moluccas are these series of islands in Indonesia called the Spice Islands. And the main things we get from there are cloves, nutmeg, and mace. Cloves are the unopened pink flower buds of the clove tree. So you can see how much they do resemble those pink flower buds and they're dried. Of course, they oxidize to this very dark color. And nutmeg and mace comes from the fruit of the nutmeg tree, which is, of course, another evergreen or tropical tree. It's grown in places like Sri Lanka, Sumatra, and Grenada. Of course, now it's grown in other places as well. But the fruit is, a bit like an apricot. It looks like an apricot. And in the center of it, you've got this, this seed. And the mace, the spice mace, comes from the red arrowroot sheath that surrounds that seed. So you can go back there and you can see it in its natural state. Then you take it off, and as it dries, it darkens to this tawny color. And then it's ground into mace. Nutmeg actually comes from the inner part of the seed. So there's a very hard shell that surrounds that seed that we then grate into the spice nutmeg. So nutmeg and mace, though different spices, come from the same place, same tree, and are essentially cousins, I should say, in flavor. They're very similar, not exactly the same, but very similar. And if you've never tasted nutmeg grated fresh from that little seed, I suggest you try it because it's very different from the stuff you buy in the grocery store already ground. It has a very different flavor, much more lemony and spicy. Mace also is very similar to that. And mace is harder to find. They do have it at the, well, sometimes they have it at the Amish market in Annapolis, but you can also order it online. So nutmeg is another important spice because it was used as a status symbol, even throughout the 18th century. So these spices were all extraordinarily expensive in the medieval days in England, so expensive that they were putting these spices in everything, including savory dishes, meat dishes, stews, that sort of thing. Because you wanted to impress your guests. If you could afford it, you wanted to put it in everything, and you wanted to impress your guests. Over time, when production of nutmeg was brought to other parts of the world, when sailing improved, it was still expensive, but it was not as expensive. So it was available to more people, though certainly not available to the majority of people. But in the 18th century, even as late as that, you might own a beautiful nutmeg grater and you would bring it to dinner parties. So, you were going to dinner at the Hammond-Harwood house, possibly even in the 19th century, but, during this golden age, you might be going to dinner at the Peka house, the Bryce house, any of these grand homes. You would bring not just your nutmeg grater, but the nutmeg itself. Some of them even had a compartment for it. And you could grate nutmeg over your own food as a sign of your own personal status. Of course, if you were a host and you were able to afford it, you would put nutmeg in as many of at least the sweet dishes by this time in the 18th century as possible. Although it was still part of some savory recipes by this time. And you often see advertisements in 18th century Annapolis newspaper, in the 18th century Annapolis newspaper, the Maryland Gazette, for nutmeg graters. So like this one, it says chased and plain silver nutmeg graters. You could find them chased, which is hammered from the outside, or repoussé, hammered from the inside. They came in ivory and sometimes wood and ivory or a mixture. And again, some had compartments to hold the nutmegs. Durham mustard. So mustard seed, of course, has been around for a long time. But in 1720, Mrs. Clements of Durham, England, discovered that you could grind mustard seed into a really fine flour or powder. And when you did that, it produced a stronger, sharper, spicier flavor. And that mustard was then marketed as Durham mustard. And we have records of Durham mustard being imported as early as the 1750s in Annapolis. And you can see this advertisement here from 1756, 55, 56 for best Durham mustard. Durham mustard is now sold as Coleman's mustard, but any fine floured or powdery mustard is essentially the same thing, but Coleman sort of bought the rights to this in 1814. Now I want to look at some exotic Mediterranean and Southern European imports. Lemons from Lisbon in Portugal, very, very common. Limes, imported quite regularly in the 18th century. And here it says good Barbados limes, such as will keep the winter to be sold reasonably by the barrel. So these were, of course, important in the wintertime, which is when they're in season. And here we have Seville oranges, so they'd be from Seville, Spain. And citron. So this is a fruit we don't really see too much of anymore. We probably seen the candied variety of it. Any fruit cakes usually have citron. Those citron's not always, the kind you find now is not always as good as the real thing. Sometimes I'm not even sure what they make it out of. But when you've had the real candied citron, it's much more flavorful than the stuff you find in those commercialized fruit cakes. But citron is a large fruit. It has a very thick rind. Supposedly all other citrus fruits were derived through a hybridization of the citron. So it's sort of related to all oranges, limes, and lemons. Probably native to India, but cultivated early in Persia and the Mediterranean regions, was in Spain by the 12th century. And it was extraordinarily popular in its candied form in British and North American cuisines in the 18th century. Raisins. Raisins were another very popular dried fruit that were put into a variety of different cakes and puddings, things of that nature. A lot of times they were called Malaga raisins because they came from the port city of Malaga in Spain on the southern coast. Also referred to sometimes as muscatels. They were very large and plump, and they were sold on the stems, and they needed to be seeded before use. So again, you would need a lot of labor in your kitchen to be able to use these. So again, a mark of status. This was something that in this area most likely would have required enslaved help, enslaved labor to cook with these. An alternative to this would be Zante currants, and they come originally from the Greek island of Corinth, which is also, that region is also known as Zante. And in the 18th century, we often see this word currants written as currans, C-U-R-R-A-N-S, and it's essentially just a corruption of the term Corinth or Corinths. They come from Corinth, these little tiny raisins essentially made from these tiny grapes. And eventually currants was mispronounced into currants. So these are different from red, black, or white currants, which is a fruit that grows, in America and England. It's a little bit different than that. They share a name because they look similar, but other than that, they are not the same. And these, importantly, were so tiny, the grapes were so tiny that even though they contained seeds, the seeds were so tiny that even when dried, you didn't have to remove them because they were imperceptible. You couldn't tell they were there. Figs, something again we think of as being, Italian, Mediterranean, were definitely coming into Maryland, probably dried. Other things like anchovies, capers, and olives from Spain and France, very popular. Oils or salad oils, often just referred to as either Florence oil or Lucca oil. So olive oils coming in from those countries. And then a variety of nuts, in particular almonds. They date back to the 13th century in British cookery and remained extraordinarily popular throughout into the 20s, is still popular today in a lot of British cooking and baked goods recipes. They use a lot of almond paste or marzipan. So almond paste is usually 50% ground almonds, 50% sugar. Marzipan is 50% almond paste with 50% sugar. So it's very sweet. They're often used to coat sugar plums, sugar plums are any coated, sugar-coated nut or seed or fruit. So in the picture here, these white Jordan almonds, Jordan almonds, just a way that they would have told you where the almonds were coming from, but now we refer to these sugar-coated almonds as Jordan almonds. And of course, English walnuts were also being imported. Other exotic items we have are isinglass, which is a gelling agent that originally came from the bladder of beluga sturgeon from the Black and Caspian Seas of Russia. The air bladders of sturgeon are very rich in collagen, which is a protein that creates this gelling effect. In 1795, a method for developing isinglass was created, being able to use local codfish, which made it cheaper. Costly colorants. So if you wanted to color your gels, your gelatins, or any of your foods really, if you wanted to make them yellow, you could buy imported saffron, which could come, English saffron probably came from Saffron Weldon in England. That was one of their major saffron growing regions. If you wanted to dye your food red, you would use either red cochineal, which was extraordinarily expensive. It's the dried beetle. It's the shell of the dried beetle from Mexico, or madder, which is a plant, which would give a more of an orangey red, and it was a little bit more affordable and very popular in the Tudor days to dye clothing as well. Or you could also buy red and yellow sanders, which are the dried stems of sandalwood. So it's not the roots, the tree itself, the wood itself. And those are all very good colorants. Starches such as sago or salep, which we would sort of associate with tapioca. It's really a precursor to tapioca or arrowroot. It's a starch from a tropical palm tree found in Southeast Asia and New Guinea. And it was exported in the 18th century. And it formed, again, small pearls or balls, just like tapioca balls or pearls today. And it was very, very popular in cookery for the sick. So they would make these sago puddings in particular. You can make drinks out of it. You can make a variety of different things for it. In the 19th century, it becomes more accessible because they developed ways of mechanizing the production of it. Vinegars, you see a lot of advertisements for distilled or white wine vinegars. Those are the most popular. Orange flower water, rosewater, these were essentially perfumes that were distilled from either the damask rose petals for rosewater or orange blossoms. And they have Middle Eastern or Northern African origins. They were brought to Europe by returning crusaders in the very early 11th century or so. And they became very popular in medieval British cookery, as well as French and other regions of Europe. They are flowery. They're not my particular favorite, but a lot of people really like them. I like them in small doses. But essentially they're not, the flavors are not overpowering. It's just simply different. We associate liquid flavorings as being vanilla, which is a very different flavor than what you're going to get with these. And tamarinds. This is something you probably would not expect. Tamarind is a pod that creates these seeds that have a sweet and sour flavor to them. They're very rich in acid as well as sugar. And they come from trees in Africa and India, so are very common in those cuisines. And when the British were stationed in India in particular, during the British Raj, during the occupation of India, they started to like some of the British cuisine, or the British started to like some of the Indian cuisine, particularly curries. And curries often have tamarind paste in them. And so when the Brits left India and went back to England, or if they came to the colonies, they wanted to have access to these tamarinds. And tamarinds can be shipped very easily. They don't spoil. So you can keep them for a very long period of time and make paste out of the seeds as you like. I think it tastes a little bit like iced tea mixed with a little bit of lemon. And then you can add sugar to it if you're making a drink out of it, or you can just add it to curries. And curry was a hugely popular in the 18th century, a variety of different curries. You could curry anything. Chicken was probably the most popular. And they're not recreating curries in exactly the same way that they first tasted them in India. They're making their own varieties of them, and so sort of their own sort of corruption of those recipes. But the tamarinds would definitely have added a distinct flavor to that. It's very possible that enslaved Africans and African Americans who were free likely bought tamarinds that were being imported. But you know, it's important to note that they were not being imported to meet the demands of the African market or African American market. It was more about meeting the demands of the Brits. And here's an ad for tamarinds. You can see tamarinds listed at the bottom. And chocolate. Chocolate was big. Betsy Rideout was the sister to John Rideout, who was the secretary to colonial governor Horatio Sharp. And she came to Annapolis in 1764 to join her brother. And she wrote about certain parties called routs that she went to, she attended. And she wrote, "The treat besides wine and punch is tea, chocolate, and queen cake." And when she's saying chocolate here, she means a drink. She means a hot chocolate drink. 18th century America, there were chocolate grinders. So chocolate of itself was being imported, but it was also being ground from cacao beans, which were being imported in a variety of different places, mostly in the north, in New England, also in New York. And Philadelphia was a major chocolate grinding place. There were only two known chocolate grinders in the South. One was in Charleston, South Carolina, and one was right in Annapolis. And that was a little bit early for our time period, but it was Isaac Navarro, who was probably a Sephardic Jew, who came to Annapolis and started advertising over the course of 4 months at the end of 1748. And then he disappears. He leaves Annapolis. I believe he goes to New York and takes up work there. But he starts his own business grinding chocolate and selling chocolate. Earlier, I do find another man who was a possible chocolate grinder, John Davison. He was a merchant and druggist. In his probate inventory, there's over 100 pounds of chocolate is found, so already made chocolate. But more importantly, 400 pounds of chocolate nuts or cacao beans were found. And to me, that means he was actually grinding the cacao or the chocolate nuts into chocolate to sell. And chocolate was often considered a medicine at this point in time as well, because it was considered to be good for throat ailments, because it coats your throat. It's very viscous. And of course, chocolate has like over 200 chemicals that we don't even understand today. So definitely can be used medically for anything. It has caffeine in it, just makes you feel good no matter what. But chocolate was also imported, again, possibly from New England, possibly from Philadelphia, very likely could have come from London, could have come from France, it could have come from a variety of places. So very, very much in import into Annapolis. But again, chocolate and slavery are not dissimilar. So in the 18th century, most of the chocolate nuts or the cacao is coming from Mexico, from the Chiapas region, a variety of Caribbean islands, and South America, particularly Curacao, Venezuela, and Brazil. A variety of plantations in all these different locations were run by the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, Portuguese, and British, where early on, particularly in Mexico, Native Americans were forced to work on these cacao plantations, but they rebelled, fled, that didn't work out. And they, of course, were replaced with Africans. And this is still an issue today. So be careful when you're buying chocolate, because make sure it says fair trade or direct trade. Those will guarantee that the workers are being treated fairly and paid fairly. Tea, this is some tea equipage at Hammond-Harwood House and some teapots at Riversdale. Records of household consumption of coffee do not actually begin to overtake the consumption of tea in America until the 1830s and really in the 1860s. Probate inventories from the year 1800 prove that half the households in America had equipage to host a proper tea party. So that's a fair amount. Even people who were poor at this point had some form of tea, knowledge of tea. And it goes throughout the early 19th century as well. And here would be a common ad that you would see in 18th century Annapolis for teas, for Bowie, Congo, green, and Hyson teas. Those were probably the most common. There were others. Of the green teas, the bold ones here are the ones that you see most commonly. So common green tea, just basic green tea, probably not the best quality, but decent quality would be available. Hyson, which was named for a merchant who first imported it. The leaves are closely curled and small. and sometimes even have a blue tinge to them. Hyson skin was an inferior version of Hyson. It was made with coarser yellowed leaves. Young Hyson was the highest quality tea, not just of the Hysons or the green teas, but probably of all the teas that were imported. It was the most expensive. It had the highest tax levied on it. And it was part of the Boston Tea Party. That was a small part of the Boston Tea Party, but it was there. It was some of the tea that was dumped into the harbor in Boston. Gunpowder is another version of green tea. Sometimes it's oolong, meaning it's not black, but it's not green. It's sort of in the middle there, semi-fermented. It's a high quality tea that is processed into small balls that make them look like granulated gunpowder. And then black teas. So black teas are often named for where they're from or the grade leaf that are being used to make them. So souchong teas are made from souchong leaves, and you can see in this image. So they're further down on the stem, meaning they're bigger and tougher. Not the best quality, still pretty good, but not the finest quality. Pecco teas are the highest quality. So don't be fooled though, when you see your Lipton or red rose tea and it's labeled as orange Pecco or Pecco, doesn't mean that those teas are from the highest. It means that it's probably from the Pecco leaves, but probably not full leaf, obviously. They're from ground up bits, or fannings is what they're called. Peccos are usually, again, as I said, the highest. They can be further marked as you can see here, flowering orange Pecco, and there's a variety of other versions of this as well. I'm just giving you sort of the basics here. And sometimes these teas often contain the white tea flowers mixed into it. That would make it the best if you had some of those. Kongus are made from the larger leaves than Peccos, and again, it could be a variety. It's similar to Bowie teas, which were probably the most common. Bowie tea made up the majority of the tea that was dumped in the Boston Harbor for the Boston Tea Party. It kind of became known as any kind of common black tea. It started out in the early 18th century being an elite beverage, but kind of became known as just this generic black tea. And sometimes it's got a smoky flavor to it as well. So sometimes these teas were heated with a variety of things. It could be steam, or it could be, in this case, smoke, and imparts this smoky flavor. So if you like a lapsang souchong is also a smoky style of a tea. So it's similar to that. This brings up the Boston Tea Party, which is, we've talked about the Boston Tea Party, and that led to the Annapolis Tea Party and the burning of the Peggy Stewart. And the Peggy Stewart was a ship that was left London with a load of tea. And this was after the Boston Tea Party occurred and the closing of the Port of Boston. And the merchants, Dick and Stewart, decided they were going to try to import tea into America, into Annapolis, despite the restrictions and the patriot cause for independence and against this tea tax. The ship's captain declared his cargo as was, he didn't lie. And so it meant it had to be taken to Annapolis, where the tea tax had to be paid if anything was going to be unloaded. And Stewart paid the tea tax, which angered patriotic Annapolitans. But of course, Stewart claimed he had to pay it because there were 53 indentured servants on board and they could not be let off the ship until that tax on the entire cargo was paid. This led to a lot of controversy and a lot of anger at Stewart. Negotiations were undertaken and an agreement was reached where the tea would be burned. After paying the tax on it, the tea would be burned, so Stewart couldn't benefit from selling it, and a public apology would be made. Hammond-Harwood House's very own Matthias Hammond published a denunciation of Stewart on October 15th, and basically saying, he's a loyalist to England. He has a history of dubious dealings. We can't trust him. A gallows was set up in front of Stewart's house, which is still standing on Hanover Street in downtown Annapolis. And one of the leaders of the Annapolis Tea Party, Dr. Charles Warfield, offered Stuart two options. He said, quote, "You must either go with me and apply the torch to your own vessel as well as the tea, or hang before your own door." Needless to say, Stuart chose the latter, and the burning of the Peggy Stuart in the Annapolis harbor ensued. And in the exhibition, Decadent Décor, the Peggy Stuart bowl is on display, and it is a punch bowl believed to have been on board the Peggy Stuart and removed, obviously, before the burning of that ship. Coffee was also imported into Annapolis, and it wasn't as big a deal as tea, but coffee houses were a big deal. And in general, coffee houses were places where in the 18th century where men only could go to drink coffee as well as tea and chocolate and other things. They could read newspapers or hear them being read out loud. They could smoke, discuss business. And in Annapolis in particular, at the Maryland Coffee House, which opened in 1767 on Main Street, you could buy subscriptions to books. You could go visit the dentist who would travel there occasionally. You could seek rewards for runaways, indentured servants, or enslaved, buy, sell land, slaves, or ships, and have meetings there of the Annapolis Lottery, Annapolis Trustees of the Poor, the Lunatic Club, the Hominy Club, etc. So it was really a community center. In the 19th century, that's when coffee became a thing. It becomes a thing in America after the War of 1812, when there were some really deep-seated animosities towards the English. So British imports of tea were not popular. And then in the Civil War, when a lot of the soldiers were given coffee, and it helped keep them alive or keep them awake, which was seen as a good thing. So over the course of the 19th century, Americans really fell in love with coffee, and you see the ads going from just Jamaica coffee or coffee to a variety of places where, listing those places where the coffee came from, particularly Brazil. And just a side note, in the 19th century, expanded trade to Brazil from Baltimore becomes, so large that 1/3 of all coffee entering the United States entered through Baltimore, particularly at two wharves in Fells Point, Belts and Browns. And in the 1880s and 1890s, 75 Baltimore vessels were coming in and out of those ports, and constituted 1/4 of all the business of that port. So very, very big. To end, we're going to just quickly look at some alcoholic drinks, beer in particular. The earliest Maryland beers would have been just home brews. You made 3 different strengths with one batch of mash: strong, table, and small. So small would have the lowest alcohol content. If you had extra, you sold it to neighbors or opened up your own little makeshift tavern. The earliest known brewery in Maryland actually was opened in Annapolis in 1703 by Benjamin Fordham on property that was originally part of the Hammond-Harwood house property that Matthias Hammond owned. He owned 4 lots. 2 of them butt up against currently against the Peka house. And on one of those lots was where this brewery was believed to have been. It was then sold to Thomas Bordley in about 1716 to 18. And on that property, they found a brew house. I believe archaeologists have found a brew house, a malt house, a kitchen, and a stable. Beer was also made by other brewers in Annapolis, particularly this one, John Judy, who set up for just a few months and then decided to go back to Germany. But there were a variety of brewers in Annapolis, as well as in other areas of Maryland. So of course, hops would be something that's going to be imported. And this is just an image of hops. Hops would most likely have come from the Kent region of England, and particularly in the 18th century. And you can see an ad here for very good hops, and you see that all over. Beer was also imported, already made, again, from England, particularly from London or from Bristol. So this is a porter and Bristol beer. Wine was also imported. The most popular was claret. That was basically a Bordeaux wine, a red wine. Now it's just a term for any red wine. Canary, Tenerife, Lisbon, these were all white, somewhat sweet wines, and then various fortified wines. Most wines were coming from Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, and Germany, all common today as big wine producers. And then fortified wines. So these were imported from Europe. They were a fixture in wealthy homes. And port, sherry, Malaga, vermouth, and Madeira are all examples. Fortification is when strong spirits, like some pure distillates, would be added to the wine before it completes its fermentation. And what's going to happen here is the alcohol content will increase to about 20%. And this increase in alcohol kills mold and bacteria, which would then cause these wines to go bad over these long voyages, particularly when they're being exported over long distances. And what's happening here is you're going to have more fermentation, meaning yeast is going to work on eating the sugars that are in there. It's going to also, or it's going to, the yeast is going to eat the sugar and release more of the alcohol. That's why you have the increased alcohol content. Madeira is probably the most popular in 18th century Maryland. You see an ad here for choice Madeira wine. Madeira is an island in the Atlantic, about 440 miles west of Morocco, which was colonized by the Portuguese in 1421. You can see it here on the map. And it started out as an unfortified wine, Madeira, made from the Malvoisie grape from Sicily, and eventually just became known as, it's called Malmsey wine, or sort of a corruption of that word Malvoisie, Malmsey. So called Malmsey or Madeira. And you can buy it. It still looks like this today. So unfortified in 15th centuries and 16th centuries, even though it was being exported, it was being exported more locally to Europe. Once it started to be exported to places as far away as the New World in the 17th century, they had to change things a little bit, and they had to start fortifying it. So in the 1750s, they started to add a grape-based distillate to that process to, again, increase that alcohol content. When they pack it up and put it on these ships, as the ship sails through warm temperatures, it creates oxidation of the Madeira, and the rocking motion of the ships, as well as the heat, sought to mature the wine and cut off its raw edges. And it really made it a much better product. It made it softer and smoother. And it became so popular that Madeira producers on Madeira purposely aged the wine on ships. So they would send it as ballast on journeys that went to particularly warm places like India or South America. And then they would return it to Madeira, where it was then sold to local, in the local Madeira area, to Europe, or then again to the New World. And they call this Vino de Rhode, or wines of the round voyage. And this is still happening, but they use mechanical ships now, I should say. They just have factories where they have machinery that mimics the heat and the action of a ship. And you can buy a variety of different Madeiras today based on different time periods and the amount of heat, exposure, and all that. There's multiple varieties. Finally, ho, 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 and a bottle of rum. We have rum is a very early and common import into Maryland. It comes from Jamaica, Barbados, West Indies, as well as New England. Of course, you can't have punch without rum. It's an essential ingredient. And in the South, and particularly Maryland, Virginia, punch equaled hospitality in colonial Chesapeake society. Punch was then switched over to whiskey. It became a common substitute to become more patriotic during the days of the Revolution. So you have whiskey-based rums. And John Adams wrote to Abigail Adams in 1777 saying, whiskey is used here instead of rum, and I don't see, but it is just as good. So, as a good patriot, it's just as good as rum. And then Arak is another import. It's a distilled spirit from Southeast Asia. It's the fermented juice of the toddy coconut tree. And nowadays it's made by adding fermented coconut juice to distilled rice and sugar. Not popular, but certainly something you see here in Maryland in the 18th century. And brandy is a distilled wine, essentially. So brandy comes from brandy wine, which means burned wine. It's fermented mashed fruit, usually grapes, but it could be any fruit that was distilled to yield this fruit-based spirit. Cognac is brandy. It's a grape-based brandy made in the Cognac region of Western France. So all Cognac is brandy, but not all brandy is Cognac, because if it doesn't come from the Cognac region, it can't be called Cognac. French brandy was a very common import. It didn't always refer to it as Cognac, but you see French brandy. And then you see flavored brandies, particularly peach and apple, but there are other ones in the 19th century as well. So that's the end. The 19th century, we have an expanded selection of exotic imports into Maryland, including champagne, which starts to be exported, Parmesan cheese, macaroni, vermicelli, and lots of other things you see coming in more detail. As you may have known, you could have opted to buy a tasting box to accompany this program. There are still a few left if you would like to get one now. It's got an assortment of teas, spices, tamarind, the Durham Mustard, muscovado sugar. So it's got a variety of things in there. If you'd like to try some of these, please contact the gift shop or call the main line for Hammond-Harwood House, and you can order a box and then pick it up at your leisure at the Hammond-Harwood House gift shop. If you'd like any recipes, videos, articles, more, please visit my website at atasteofhistory.net. You can also contact me directly there if you have any questions that you think of afterwards. But I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now. And if anyone has any questions, please let me know. Now's the time. And don't forget to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question.
I have a question, Joyce.
Sure.
Was rum agricole, which is the rum made from fermented fresh cane juice instead of molasses, was that a popular drink in early England? Or
yeah, so you don't see it called that. You'll see distilled cane spirits. That's the closest I think you would come to that, that I've seen in the 18th century. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
I saw in one of the ads, it said like a barrel or a cask of fermented cane juice or something like that. Or fermented cane spirit, that's what it was. Right. Good old cane spirit. I was wondering if that was the rum agricole.
I think that might be it. It's hard to know. It's hard to know. As far as I know, that would be the closest you'd get to that, you know. Any other questions? No? Well, again, this will be recorded if you'd like to, you know, if you have any other questions, you want to go back, you can look at it again. It will be sent to you. And again, you can contact me through my website if you have any other questions. And again, if you'd like to order one of the tastings boxes, you can certainly, you know, call the main line number for Hammond-Harwood House and do that. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.